Ethan Thompson had always known hardship. Growing up on a small farm in the heart of the Midwest, he had learned from an early age the value of hard work, of determination, and of sacrifice. His parents, John and Clara, were good people, but life in their rural town was unforgiving. Every season was a battle to make ends meet. Their land, though rich in soil, was unyielding. The crops sometimes failed, the weather was unpredictable, and their small house felt too big for the few possessions they had. Ethan had long carried the weight of their struggles on his shoulders, feeling the constant pressure to succeed where his parents hadn't been able to. His younger sister, Emily, was still in school, and that made things even harder. She had big dreams of becoming a doctor someday, but the cost of education was something neither Ethan nor his parents could afford. Every time he looked at her, hopeful and innocent, it only reminded him of the fragile dreams they clung to in a world that didn't seem to care. Ethan had always been determined to change his family's fate. He knew that education was the only way out, but the local school offered little more than a pathway to becoming a farmer or a factory worker. He had a sharp mind and ambition that pushed him further than his surroundings allowed. But there was no escaping the reality that their situation was dire. As his father's arthritis worsened and his mother grew frail from years of backbreaking labor, Ethan could see that their future was slipping away from them. The decision to drop out of school had been hard, but he knew it was the only way he could help his family. He packed his things in a small duffel bag, leaving behind the few belongings he could carry. And with only a handful of money and a fierce resolve, he boarded a bus to New York City. His parents protested, but they knew that it was a sacrifice that could change everything for them. They didn't want their son to be stuck in a life of struggle, not when there was a chance for something more. The trip to the city felt like a dream he had once dared to whisper in the dark, now finally coming to life. The vast city, with its towering buildings and endless streets, was nothing like the quiet fields of his hometown. It was overwhelming, a cacophony of noises, faces, and endless movement. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt small in the grand scheme of things, but also, strangely, hopeful. He didn't have much, just the clothes on his back and a sense of determination that burned brighter than the brightest lights of the city. Ethan started from the bottom, taking on any job he could find: construction labor, janitor work, even working as a dishwasher. Every penny he earned, he sent back home, hoping it would make a difference. His family needed it. He worked long hours, sometimes in sweltering heat, other times in the biting cold, but there was no giving up. Each day was a struggle, but each day brought him closer to the hope that he could change his family's future. But the city didn't make it easy. Ethan had little experience, and jobs were hard to come by. He was constantly running from one opportunity to the next, trying to stay ahead of his bills and find stability. Yet with each rejection, with each setback, he held on to the idea that he was doing something important. He was building a future for them. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was all he had. One day, while walking home from a job that had paid less than he'd hoped, Ethan passed a high-end nightclub. The bright neon lights called out to him, and for a brief moment, he stood frozen, staring at the lavishness of it all. He couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, a longing for a life he couldn't even dream of. But as he turned to leave, a man in a sharp suit approached him. "Hey, you looking for work?" the man asked, his voice smooth and confident. Ethan hesitated. I don't know. What's the job?" The man smiled. "Server. It's not glamorous, but it pays well." The job seemed out of reach, but Ethan was desperate. After a quick interview, the man offered him a chance. The nightclub was upscale, one of those places where the city's elite came to drink, dance, and socialize. The thought of it was both daunting and exciting. But with no other options, Ethan accepted the job, even though it felt like a world far removed from his humble beginnings. The nightclub was a revelation. It was everything Ethan had never known: luxurious, sleek, and full of people who seemed to exist in an entirely different reality. The polished floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and rich colognes. The music was a constant thrum in the background, pulsing through the club like the heartbeat of the city itself. Ethan, with his worn clothes and work-worn hands, felt like an outsider. He had been hired as a server, which meant he was responsible for ensuring that drinks were filled, that food was served, and that the guests were well taken care of. At first, he felt awkward, unsure of the etiquette, of the way to move and talk to the people around him. The other servers, all dressed in expensive uniforms, looked at him with a mixture of amusement and judgment. He wasn't one of them, and he knew it. But Ethan wasn't one to back down. He learned quickly. He observed how the other servers interacted with the wealthy clientele, how they carried themselves with grace and confidence. Slowly, Ethan began to mimic their movements, adapting to the rhythm of the club. He learned how to smile with just the right amount of charm, how to glide between tables without stumbling, how to serve drinks and food with a sense of poise he had never thought himself capable of. The work wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something, like his efforts were paying off in a way that his previous jobs never had. He sent money home, of course, but now he was starting to build something for himself. He had a small room in a shared apartment, and though it wasn't much, it was his. He could see his dreams taking shape. One night, as Ethan was delivering a tray of drinks to a VIP section, he accidentally bumped into a woman, one of the regulars, he noted, who was sitting with a group of friends at a private table. The drinks spilled over her dress, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The woman, tall and elegant, stared at him, her eyes a piercing shade of blue. "Watch where you're going," she said, her voice cool but not angry. Ethan, flustered, began to apologize profusely, but she raised a hand to stop him. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm not upset. Are you?" Ethan blinked. No, I'm sorry. I'll fix it right away." But she shook her head, her lips curling into a small smile. "Don't worry about it. It's just a dress." Her calmness was striking, especially compared to the other patrons who might have thrown a fit over such a mishap. As she adjusted her dress, she looked at Ethan more closely. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked. Her gaze was sharp, but there was a genuine curiosity behind it. Ethan nodded, feeling a bit more self-conscious. "Yeah, I've been working here for a little while now." She smiled again. "Well, I'm Claire Montgomery. And you're?" "Ethan," he said, still unsure what to make of the woman in front of him. There was something different about her, something that made him feel both nervous and strangely at ease. "Well, Ethan, I hope your next job doesn't involve spilling anything else on me," she joked lightly, and Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "I'll do my best," he said, smiling shyly. It was a brief exchange, but it left Ethan thinking. There was something about Claire, something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that made him feel both out of place and, for some reason, as if he wanted to be in her world. Little did he know, this brief encounter would change everything. Ethan couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Claire Montgomery. The way she had smiled, calm and unbothered, when his clumsy mistake could have sent most people into a rage. Even after weeks of working at the nightclub, he still felt like an outsider, surrounded by people who seemed to live in a world so distant from his own. But Claire was different. She was poised, elegant, and yet there was something remarkably down-to-earth about her. Her demeanor suggested wealth and privilege, but there was no arrogance in her gaze. The next time she visited the club, Ethan couldn't help but watch her as she entered, dressed in a sleek black dress that shimmered under the club's lights. She looked like someone who belonged in a world of luxury, and yet, when she spotted Ethan, her expression softened as if she remembered him from their first encounter. It was a strange feeling, being noticed by someone who seemed so far removed from his reality. This time, Claire didn't wait for a server to come to her table. She approached Ethan directly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her voice warm. "I hope you're not still holding yourself responsible for the drink spill. You're doing just fine." She gave him a reassuring smile. Ethan was stunned. "Oh no, I mean it's fine. Really, I should have been more careful." He felt a bit foolish under her attention, but her calmness made him feel strangely at ease. She waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. We all have our clumsy moments," she said with a small laugh. As she spoke, Ethan realized that she wasn't like the others who came to the nightclub, pretentious, detached, and used to the best the world could offer. Claire had an openness to her, a curiosity about people, and a kindness that made her stand out. There was no mask of superiority, no judgment in her eyes, just an honest interest. Their conversation was brief but pleasant. She asked him about his background, about why he had come to New York, and what he hoped to achieve. Ethan, who had become accustomed to keeping his personal life guarded, found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about his family back in the Midwest, about his struggles to make a living and send money home. It was strange, talking about his past in a place like this, surrounded by people who seemed to have everything, while he was just trying to get by. But Claire listened without interruption, her attention fully on him, and for a moment, Ethan felt as though his story mattered. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense but kind. "You're doing what you can to make a better life for yourself and your family. I admire that," she said. "Not many people would take the risks you have. It's rare, you know." Her words, so simple yet sincere, struck Ethan more deeply than he expected. He had never really thought of his choices in that way. To him, it had always just been about survival, about doing what was necessary. But Claire made him feel as though his sacrifices were something worth acknowledging. Before she left, she gave him a generous tip and smiled at him once more. "I'll be back soon, Ethan. I'll look forward to seeing you again." And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the night as effortlessly as she had arrived. The encounter left Ethan feeling conflicted. He couldn't explain why Claire's presence affected him so deeply, or why he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. There was something magnetic about her, something that stirred a longing in him for a life he wasn't sure he deserved. Claire Montgomery wasn't like anyone Ethan had ever met. Over the next few weeks, she continued to visit the nightclub, often requesting Ethan to be her server. At first, he was a little uncertain about her repeated visits. Was it out of genuine interest, or did she simply enjoy the novelty of having someone from a completely different world cater to her needs? But the more he got to know her, the more he realized that it wasn't just about the service. There was something more, something deeper. Each time she returned, Claire greeted him with a warm smile, always asking how he was doing, inquiring about his family, and sharing small bits of her own life. Her questions were never intrusive, just curious enough to make him feel as though she was genuinely invested in his well-being. She told him about her travels, about the high society events she attended, but always with a certain humility that set her apart from the people Ethan saw around him. Their conversations, initially brief and polite, soon grew longer. Claire would ask about his dreams, his plans, and Ethan found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone else. For the first time, he realized that Claire saw him not just as a server, but as a person. Someone with his own hopes and ambitions, someone who wasn't just defined by his circumstances. One evening, Claire arrived at the club wearing a simple yet elegant dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She had a certain grace about her, and when she saw Ethan, she waved him over. There was no pretension in her manner, just a friendly openness that made Ethan feel at ease. "Ethan," she said, smiling warmly, "I've been thinking about you. How are things going with your family?" Ethan sat down across from her, glancing around to make sure he wasn't neglecting his other duties. "Things are okay. I'm sending money home every month, trying to make sure they're all right," he replied, grateful for her concern. Claire nodded thoughtfully, her eyes thoughtful. "I admire your dedication to them. It's not easy, living so far away from family, trying to carry the weight of their well-being on your shoulders. I can't imagine the pressure." Ethan shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the attention, but at the same time, he appreciated her understanding. "It's just what I have to do. I don't really know any other way." "You're doing a good thing," Claire said softly, her voice full of sincerity. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You're important, Ethan." Her words caught him off guard. He had always focused so much on helping his family that he hadn't really thought about his own needs or desires. Claire's words were a gentle reminder that he wasn't just a tool for supporting others. He was a person with his own life, his own future to consider. As the weeks passed, Ethan found himself looking forward to Claire's visits more and more. Her generosity, both in her conversations and in the way she treated him, began to feel like a lifeline in his otherwise monotonous existence. It wasn't just the money she tipped him, though that certainly helped. It was the attention, the connection, the sense that someone saw him as more than just a worker in the background of their lives. But as much as Ethan enjoyed her company, he couldn't help but wonder about the true nature of their relationship. Why was Claire so interested in him? He wasn't like the men she usually associated with, wealthy, polished, and suave. He was just a young man from the Midwest, working hard to survive. What did she see in him? His thoughts were interrupted when Claire leaned in slightly, her eyes sparkling. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking. You should come out with me sometime. There's a gala next week, very exclusive. It would be a good opportunity for you to experience something different." The invitation surprised Ethan. A gala? He had never been to anything like that. But the idea of stepping into a world so far removed from his own intrigued him, and for the first time, he realized that Claire was offering him something far beyond what he had ever dreamed possible. It was tempting. It was more than tempting. It was an opportunity to change his life forever. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to say, but Claire's smile was warm, and her eyes were filled with an unspoken understanding. He couldn't refuse her. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll go." Claire's eyes lit up, and her smile grew. "Good. It'll be fun, I promise." And with that, their world, which had once been so separate, seemed to shift closer together. Ethan wasn't sure what to expect when he arrived at the gala, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming opulence of the event. As he entered the grand ballroom, his senses were assaulted by the luxury of it all. The sparkling chandeliers, the soft hum of conversation, the rich velvet furnishings, and the laughter of people dressed in their finest. For a moment, he felt like he didn't belong, as though he had stumbled into a world he had no right to enter. Claire was waiting for him, looking radiant in a floor-length gown that shimmered under the dim lights. She greeted him with a warm, welcoming smile, taking his arm and leading him into the crowd. As they walked through the room, all eyes seemed to be on her, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how easily she navigated this world, as if she had been born into it. She introduced him to several of her friends, all of them wealthy and well-known figures in New York's elite circles. At first, Ethan felt awkward, unsure of what to say or how to act around people whose lives seemed so different from his. But Claire's presence beside him was a constant reassurance, and slowly he began to relax. As the night wore on, Claire pulled him aside to a quieter area of the ballroom, away from the chatter and the music. She handed him a glass of champagne, and they stood in silence for a moment, watching the people around them. "You look a little out of place," Claire said with a teasing smile. "But you're doing fine." Ethan chuckled, his nerves still raw. "I never imagined I'd be here. This is nothing like where I come from." "I know," Claire said, her tone softening, "but it's a world you deserve to be in. You've worked hard, Ethan. You've earned a chance to experience this." There was something about her words, the sincerity in her voice, that made Ethan's chest tighten. It wasn't just that she had brought him into this world. It was the way she made him feel like he was worthy of it. As the night went on, he found himself slipping deeper into the allure of the luxury around him. The fine wines, the delicious food, the elegant people. All of it felt intoxicating. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt as though he was not just a spectator in a world of wealth, but a participant in it. As they walked through the crowd, Claire's hand brushed against his, a fleeting touch that seemed to say more than words ever could. Ethan couldn't deny that there was something about her. Something magnetic. It wasn't just her beauty or her wealth. It was the way she made him feel like he mattered, like he belonged. By the end of the night, as Claire escorted him back to his apartment, Ethan felt as though he had stepped into a dream. His old life, with its struggles and hardships, seemed so far away, and the new life Claire was offering him felt like an escape. When they reached his apartment, Claire turned to him, her expression serious but kind. "You've done well tonight, Ethan," she said, "and I want to make sure you have more of these opportunities. You deserve them." He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but something in her eyes made him wonder if she was offering him more than just a chance to enjoy luxury. The thought stirred something in him, a sense of excitement, but also uncertainty. Was this world truly for him, or was it just an illusion, a temporary escape from the reality he had known. As Claire left, she kissed him on the cheek, a gesture that felt more intimate than he expected. "I'll see you soon," she said before disappearing into the night. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time, his mind racing. The glamour, the wealth, the attention. Everything Claire had shown him seemed like a dream. And yet, part of him wondered if it was too good to be true. The days following the gala felt like a blur. Ethan found himself wrapped up in the whirlwind that was Claire Montgomery's world. Luxury, excitement, and opportunities he had never dreamed of. Claire continued to shower him with attention, taking him to expensive restaurants, buying him designer clothes, and introducing him to people who could open doors he never thought possible. Ethan had never owned anything of real value before. The clothes Claire bought him made him feel like a different person. For the first time in his life, he looked in the mirror and saw someone who could pass for someone important, someone who had made it. But the strange thing was, he hadn't done anything to earn it. Not really. It was all thanks to Claire. She had given him everything, and as the days went by, he began to wonder just how much of himself he had lost in the process. Claire had offered him more than just material things. She had given him a new life. She had arranged for him to live in a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, far from the small, cramped space he had rented before. The apartment was sleek and modern, with sweeping views of the city skyline. It was the kind of place that people dreamed of living in. And yet, as Ethan stood in the large living room, staring out over the lights of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had everything he had ever wanted: luxury, comfort, status. But there was a hollowness to it all. The days felt empty, the nights even worse. He had no real purpose here, no real connection to anything except the lavish life that Claire had created for him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't know what he was searching for. Was it the money? The fame? Or was it something more elusive? Something real? Something that connected him to his past, to his family, and to himself? One evening, as he sat on the balcony, looking out at the city lights, Claire came to join him. She sat beside him, her presence as comforting as always, but Ethan could sense a shift in the air between them. There was something unspoken, something that had changed since the gala. The weight of everything Claire had given him was starting to settle on his shoulders. "You've been quiet lately," Claire said, her voice soft. "Is everything okay?" Ethan turned to look at her, meeting her gaze. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pressure to explain himself. Just a simple question, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the urge to be honest with her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I'm just not sure where I fit into all of this. You've given me everything, Claire, but I don't feel like it's enough. I don't know what I'm supposed to be anymore." Claire's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his. "You don't have to be anything you're not," she said. "You've already proven that you're capable of more than you think. But don't lose yourself in this world. I don't want you to forget who you are." Ethan nodded, but the feeling of uncertainty remained. He had everything he could ever want, and yet he felt more lost than ever. It was as if the more he had, the less he knew who he truly was. Ethan's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. No longer working at the nightclub, he now found himself surrounded by luxury: designer clothes, exclusive events, fine dining, and a penthouse apartment in Manhattan. The world that Claire had introduced him to was one of unimaginable wealth and privilege, a stark contrast to the modest beginnings he had come from. Yet, despite the material comforts, something was missing. For the first time in his life, he had everything he thought he wanted: money, status, comfort, and yet he felt emptier than ever. The excitement of the new life had faded, leaving behind a nagging sense of discontent. He had been swept up in the allure of wealth and luxury, but the more he experienced, the more disconnected he felt from it all. Claire continued to shower him with attention, her affection towards him as constant as the luxury surrounding them. Yet, in the midst of it all, Ethan couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. He couldn't help but wonder what Claire really saw in him. Was it just his humility that intrigued her, or was there something more? Did she genuinely care for him, or was he simply another acquisition in her collection of indulgences? Ethan spent more time reflecting on his life, trying to reconcile his old self with the new one Claire had created for him. His past, his family, and the simple life he had left behind seemed so distant now, overshadowed by the glittering world of New York's elite. He felt like a stranger in his own life, caught between two worlds, neither of which he fully understood. One evening, after a lavish dinner at one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The lights of the city sparkled beneath him, and the quiet hum of the night felt like a distant echo. For a moment, he felt like he was trapped in a cage of luxury, a prisoner of his own choices. Claire entered the room, her presence as commanding as ever. She sat beside him, her gaze following his. "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice soft but concerned. Ethan turned to her, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "I'm just not sure where I fit into all of this," he admitted. "I thought this life would make me happy, but it doesn't feel real. It feels like I'm living someone else's life, not mine." Claire's expression softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "You don't have to be anything you're not, Ethan," she said gently. "You're here because I believe in you, but you don't have to lose yourself to fit in. This life is just a part of it. You have the power to decide what matters to you." Her words were comforting, but they also stirred something within Ethan, a deep yearning for something more than just wealth and comfort. He wanted to feel real, to have a sense of purpose beyond the luxury that surrounded him. Yet at the same time, he couldn't ignore the allure of this world, the security, the power, the promise of a future that was far removed from the struggles of his past. As Claire leaned in closer, placing a kiss on his cheek, Ethan felt a sense of confusion swirl inside him. He didn't know if he was still in love with her, or if he was simply in love with the life she had given him. He couldn't tell where his desires for wealth and comfort ended, and where his feelings for Claire began. It had been months since Claire had first introduced Ethan to the extravagant world of New York's elite. In that time, they had grown closer, and Claire's affection for him had only deepened. She had continued to lavish him with gifts, introducing him to even more exclusive events and high-profile people. But despite the wealth and the opportunities, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The unease that had been growing in his chest over the past few months had only intensified. He couldn't ignore the nagging sense that Claire's interest in him was not entirely based on kindness or affection. She had given him everything he could ever want: luxury, comfort, a life he had never imagined for himself. But was it enough? Was it real? One evening, Claire invited him to a private dinner at one of the most exclusive venues in the city, a rooftop restaurant with a stunning view of the skyline. The table was set with candles and fine china, and soft music played in the background. Claire looked more beautiful than ever, dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress that accentuated her grace and poise. As they sat down to eat, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of apprehension. There was something in the air tonight, something unspoken. Claire's gaze was intense, her eyes locked onto his, with an expression that seemed to hold a question. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ethan," she began, her tone softer than he had ever heard it, "I've been thinking about us, about the future. I know we've been through a lot together, and I want to take this to the next level. I want you to be more than just my partner in life. I want you to be my partner in everything." Ethan's heart raced. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but the way Claire looked at him, the vulnerability in her eyes, made him uneasy. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. Claire reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I want you to marry me, Ethan. Not just because I care about you, but because I want you to be by my side, to share everything I have, my life, my wealth, my future. I want you to be my equal in all of it." Ethan stared at her in shock. He had never imagined that Claire would ask him to marry her, let alone offer him such an extravagant future. The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan felt his mind racing. He had always wanted to change his life, to escape the poverty and hardship of his past. But this felt like more than just a life of luxury. It felt like a commitment, a binding promise that would change everything. I don't know what to say," Ethan stammered, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had always been grateful for everything Claire had given him, but now he was faced with a choice that went beyond wealth or comfort. This was about love, about trust, about his place in her world. Claire's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand. Take your time, Ethan. I just want you to know that I believe in you, in us. I want to build a future with you, one that's more than just about money. It's about partnership, about being together through everything. Ethan sat back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent so long searching for a way out of his old life, for a path that would lead him to something better. But now, with this proposal on the table, he was faced with a choice he hadn't anticipated. To marry Claire, to accept everything she offered him, and to step fully into her world, or to walk away and find his own path. Uncertain, but free. The answer wasn't clear. And as much as he longed for the certainty that Claire's proposal offered, part of him couldn't help but wonder if he was making a deal with the devil. Was he choosing a life of comfort at the cost of his independence? Or was this his chance at happiness? For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't know what to do. Ethan stood in the grand hall of the church, dressed in a tailored suit that Claire had chosen for him. The soft murmur of the guests, their hushed conversations blending with the solemn atmosphere, felt distant to him. It was surreal, the opulence of the day, the significance of the moment. He was about to marry Claire Montgomery, the woman who had given him everything he had ever dreamed of. Yet, despite all the luxury, the beautiful dress she wore, and the grandeur of the ceremony, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As Claire walked down the aisle toward him, her graceful steps slow and deliberate, Ethan's heart beat faster, but not in excitement. It was a mixture of fear and confusion. He had agreed to this marriage, not because of love, but because of everything Claire had offered him. He had allowed himself to believe that by marrying her, he would find his place in the world, that he would find a sense of belonging. But as he looked at her, standing before him in her perfect gown, he couldn't help but question whether this was the right choice. Was this really what he wanted? To live in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but without true connection? Claire smiled at him as they exchanged vows, her voice steady, confident, filled with emotion that felt foreign to him. She spoke of love, of partnership, of a future together, but all Ethan could think about was how distant those words felt. He repeated his vows mechanically, his mind elsewhere, his heart heavy with doubts. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan felt nothing. The ceremony felt more like a formality, a contract between two people who, on the surface, were meant to be together. But in his heart, Ethan felt like a stranger. The reception that followed was a lavish affair, filled with laughter, dancing, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Claire was the star of the evening, radiant and surrounded by her friends and colleagues, while Ethan was more of an accessory, her new husband, her new trophy. The realization hit him harder than he had anticipated. This marriage, this entire life he was living, was a facade. Claire had given him everything, wealth, status, a future beyond his wildest dreams, but the cost was high. He had become a part of her world. Yes, but he had lost his own sense of self in the process. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself increasingly disconnected from Claire. She was surrounded by people, engaging in conversations with ease, while he stood off to the side, feeling like an outsider in his own life. The lavish food, the expensive wine, the endless compliments, none of it mattered. He was no longer the hard-working young man who had dreamed of a better life. He was now part of a story that felt as though it belonged to someone else. Late that night, after the guests had left and the last of the music faded, Ethan sat alone in their penthouse apartment. The city lights glittered outside the window, a reminder of the world he now lived in. But instead of feeling comforted by the luxury, he felt more alone than ever. Claire entered the room, her face softening when she saw him sitting by the window. She walked over and sat beside him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. "Yeah, beautiful." "You're not happy, are you?" Claire asked, her tone quiet but perceptive. She had always been able to read him, to see through the facade he put up. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the city below. "I'm not sure what I am anymore," he admitted. "I thought this was what I wanted, a chance to live a different life, to escape everything I came from. But now that I'm here, I feel lost." Claire didn't respond immediately, but her hand tightened on his. "You don't have to be lost, Ethan," she said softly. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself. I've always believed in you. But I can't give you happiness if you don't find it within yourself first." Her words were kind, but they didn't bring the clarity Ethan was searching for. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life Claire had given him and the life he had left behind. The allure of wealth and luxury was undeniable, but the emptiness that filled his heart was something he couldn't ignore. As the night stretched on, Ethan realized that his marriage to Claire had become a carefully constructed illusion. It wasn't built on love, it was built on convenience. The convenience of wealth, of status, of a life that was easy and comfortable, but ultimately hollow. 1 month after their extravagant wedding, Ethan's life had settled into a strange routine. The glamour of the wedding day had faded, replaced by the cold monotony of his new existence. He spent his days in the penthouse, surrounded by luxury, but the sense of fulfillment he had once hoped for was nowhere to be found. Claire was still as attentive as ever, but there was a distance between them that neither seemed able to bridge. In the early days of their marriage, Ethan had hoped that time would bring them closer, that the emptiness he felt would be replaced by a deeper connection. But instead, he found himself drifting further from Claire. She had given him everything he had ever wanted: material wealth, status, a comfortable life. But there was no emotional connection, no real intimacy between them. The more time passed, the more Ethan realized that he wasn't just feeling disconnected from Claire. He was disconnected from himself. The man he had been before, ambitious, driven, passionate about making a better life for his family, seemed like a distant memory. He had become a shell of that person, lost in a world of excess and shallow pleasures. Claire's love for him had always been evident in the gifts she gave him, the opportunities she provided, and the way she cared for him. But Ethan couldn't help but wonder if her love was really love, or if it was just a way to control him, to make him her possession. He was her trophy husband, the man she had rescued from poverty, and now he was hers to keep. One evening, as he sat alone in their penthouse, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, Ethan received a call from his mother. Her voice was warm, familiar, but laced with concern. "How are you, son?" she asked, her words carrying the simple kindness that only a mother could offer. Ethan hesitated before answering, his gaze drifting over the luxurious apartment that felt more like a prison than a home. "I'm fine, Mom," he lied, "just adjusting to everything." "I miss you," she said softly. "Your sister's been asking about you too. I wish you could come home, even for a little while." The ache in his chest grew stronger as he listened to his mother's voice. He missed them too. He missed the simple life he had left behind. The farm, the small town, his family. He had traded all of that for a life of luxury and wealth, but now it felt empty, like a house built on sand. "I miss you too, Mom," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try to visit soon." When he hung up the phone, Ethan sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on him. He had everything he had ever dreamed of, but it wasn't enough. It never would be. He realized then that no amount of wealth or luxury could fill the void inside him. The only thing that could do that was love. Real love, the kind that was built on trust, on mutual respect, on something more than just convenience. And as Ethan sat in the quiet, empty apartment, he wondered if he could ever find that again. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Ethan's dissatisfaction with his life only deepened. The lavishness of the world Claire had enveloped him in, the penthouse apartment, the designer clothes, the exclusive parties, had begun to lose their luster. Every corner of their luxurious home felt more like a gilded cage. The weight of wealth, once a dream come true, now pressed down on him like an invisible burden. Claire, for all her beauty, elegance, and ambition, had become more of a stranger to him than a partner. She still lavished him with gifts, still included him in high society events, still smiled at him with affection, but it was all surface level. The genuine connection he had hoped to find with her never materialized. Her love for him, it seemed, was tied not to the man he truly was, but to the status he brought into her life. A status that allowed her to flaunt him in front of her wealthy circle, a symbol of her power, her ability to rescue someone from obscurity and shape him into a polished figure. And that realization hurt more than anything. The realization that the love they had was one of convenience, not just for him, but for her as well. Claire wanted Ethan not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. A success story. A beautiful, humble man who had been elevated by her generosity and power. A trophy, a perfect accessory to her otherwise flawless life. The wealth around him felt suffocating. The extravagant dinners, the high-end events, the constant parade of luxury, none of it brought him any happiness. The more time passed, the more Ethan questioned whether he was truly using Claire for the life she offered, or if he was being used by her to validate her own choices. It was impossible to tell anymore. The line between what was real and what was a transaction had blurred. The opulence surrounding him had started to feel like a distraction, a veil that kept him from seeing the truth. One afternoon, after another lonely day in the penthouse, Ethan found himself walking through the streets of Manhattan, his thoughts a swirl of confusion and longing. The city, once full of promise, now seemed cold and distant. He passed by the familiar landmarks, the busy crowds, but everything felt like it belonged to someone else, not him. He missed the simplicity of his past, the days on the farm with his family, the nights spent under the stars, the feeling of being truly connected to the world around him. He stopped in front of a small cafe, the same cafe he had walked past countless times but never entered. Today, something compelled him to go inside. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the world go by. As he took a sip, he felt a sense of clarity, however brief it was, that perhaps he had been chasing the wrong thing. All of the luxury in the world couldn't replace the connections that had truly mattered. It wasn't the designer clothes, the fancy meals, or the wealth that would make him happy. It was love, honesty, and a sense of belonging. But he wasn't sure if he could find that again. Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos of his family on the farm. He missed them more than ever. But now, after everything, he wasn't sure if he could return to the life he had once known. He had changed, or rather, he had been changed by Claire's world. The man who had once been driven by the hope of building something better for his family was now a stranger to that version of himself. He was caught between two worlds, one that held the promise of security and wealth, and one that held the warmth of genuine connection, but which seemed increasingly out of reach. As the days turned into months, Ethan's feelings of disillusionment only grew. He had it all, the wealth, the status, the luxury, but nothing filled the emptiness inside him. He had married Claire, hoping that the connection they would build over time would bring him the fulfillment he sought, but he had been wrong. The extravagant gifts, the penthouse in Manhattan, the designer clothes, none of it could replace what was missing. One evening, while Claire was away at a gala, Ethan sat alone in their penthouse, staring out the window at the skyline that had once filled him with excitement. The lights of the city twinkled, but to him they now seemed distant, cold, and artificial. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and he felt as though he was suffocating. For the first time, he realized that his entire life had become a series of transactions. His marriage, his wealth, his status, it was all part of a deal, one that he had unknowingly entered into in exchange for comfort, security, and a life that was supposed to be better than the one he had left behind. But what did it all matter if there was no real connection? He had spent so much time chasing after material things, believing that they would fill the void inside him. But now he saw the truth. It wasn't wealth that he had truly wanted. It was love. It was belonging. It was the connection he had once felt with his family. His life in the penthouse, surrounded by luxury, felt hollow. He had been given everything, but none of it had filled the part of him that craved something deeper. He thought about his family back home, his mother, his sister, and how much he missed them. He thought about the life he had left behind, the farm, the days spent working hard, but feeling a sense of purpose. He had traded that life for comfort, but now he wasn't sure if it had been worth it. When Claire returned that evening, her radiant smile seemed out of place to Ethan. She kissed him on the cheek, but there was a coldness in her gaze, something he hadn't noticed before. She went on about the gala, the people she had met, the opportunities she had made, but Ethan couldn't focus. He was too caught up in his own thoughts. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice softening when she noticed his distracted expression. "Are you okay? You've been distant lately." He looked at her, his heart heavy. He had been living in a bubble, a world built on illusion. "I'm not sure anymore," he said quietly. "I've spent so much of my life chasing after something I thought would make me happy, but now I realize I was chasing the wrong thing." Claire looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind clearer than it had ever been. "I thought this life, this world of wealth, luxury, and status, was the answer. But it isn't. I've lost sight of what really matters. I've lost sight of who I really am. And I don't know if I can keep living like this." For the first time, Ethan saw the cracks in their relationship. Claire's expression shifted, the facade of her perfection fading for a moment as she took in his words. She had built a life around him, a life of comfort and control, but she had never truly understood the depth of his discontent. Ethan stood, his heart aching as he looked out over the city. He had everything, but none of it was real. He wanted to go back, to find himself again, to find the connection he had lost, to rediscover the person he once was. "I need to go home," he said quietly. "I need to find myself again." As he walked away from the life he had built, Ethan realized that true happiness could never be bought. It wasn't in wealth or luxury, and it wasn't in the life Claire had offered him. It was in the simple, honest connections he had once known. And as he stepped away from the world he had created, he felt, for the first time in a long while, free. Ethan's journey had taken him through a world of luxury and excess, but it was the simplicity of his roots that ultimately called him back. After leaving the penthouse and the glamorous life Claire had provided, he returned to the quiet, familiar town where he had grown up. The farm, though modest, was a place of peace, a world away from the cold, glittering city he had once longed to conquer. His family welcomed him back with open arms, their lives continuing as they always had, slowly, steadily, but with warmth and purpose. His mother, with her gentle wisdom, and his sister, with her bright eyes full of curiosity, reminded him of the values he had once taken for granted: love, connection, hard work, and the simple joys of life. He found solace in their presence, realizing that these were the things that truly mattered. Though the journey back had been difficult, Ethan began to rebuild himself. He worked the land once again, side by side with his family, rediscovering the satisfaction that came from honest labor. He no longer felt the pull of the city, the allure of wealth that had once seemed so intoxicating. His happiness no longer lay in what he had or the image he projected, but in the life he had always known. The quiet strength of his family, the deep-rooted love they shared, and the realization that contentment had never been about possessions, but about presence and belonging. Occasionally, he would think of Claire, of the woman who had once offered him everything. But now, she was a memory, a chapter in his life that had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned the hard way that material wealth could never replace the wealth of love and connection. It had been an important part of his journey, but it was not the destination. In the end, Ethan realized that his true worth wasn't defined by the luxury he had experienced, but by the love he gave and received. As he sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun set over the fields, Ethan finally felt at peace. He had come full circle, not just in his physical journey, but in his heart. He was no longer the man he had been in New York, chasing after empty promises. He had become the man he was always meant to be, a man who understood that happiness wasn't found in what he owned, but in who he was. And for the first time in years, Ethan could honestly say, with no reservations, that he was truly happy. Thank you so much for taking the time to follow this journey from start to finish. I hope you felt the depth of emotions and the powerful lessons this story had to offer. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Your support means the world, and I'm so grateful to have you with me on this adventure. Until next time, take care, and I can't wait to share more stories with you.